Okay.
I was so bothered to you.
Welcome to week 2. Week 1 was probably a blur. First week of school, especially if it's a short week, you're thinking back like, whoa, I don't remember anything we did. So we'll start where we left off. Remember, we got a lot of work to do because more work for me than you. I'm trying to condense a whole year of what could be a whole year of pre-Civil War American history into less than a month. I keep saying 3 weeks, but I don't know what I'm going to do. I think we got at least this far. True?
Yes.
I
Farther.
don't even know.
Oh, we got to Massachusetts. We were at the.
We were at
Pilgrims when they came on the Mayflower. We went to Indenture.
That's where we ended? We ended here? We got more?
Not to get the shake.
That's all Jake got.
That's all I got.
Jake got thrown for a loop when we started talking about the 1619 project, right?
Yeah.
You remember what that was? Anybody remember what the 1619 project was? Go ahead. I wrote it on the board the other day,
it was,
Thursday.
To revolutionize the school system to fight racism as opposed to teach proper American history.
It's everybody's familiar with the term woke. Is there anybody that's a sophomore in high school at least that doesn't know the term woke? Raise your hand if you don't even know what I'm talking about. If I say someone's woke, raise your hand. It's okay if you have no idea what I'm talking about. I don't mean you're awake. Well, it kind of comes from you're awake. To them, it comes from the fact that you're awake to the real history of America, not the history like the 1776 report, which came out as a retort of the 1619 project, which is, hey, really, all this adoration for America is wrong because America was built and is fundamentally a racist country. And the reason that we still have problems among the racists today is because we're fundamentally racist and we got to change that. And it's okay if by reversing roles, racism's little, you can look it up if you want. Racism's okay if it's in response to racism that happened in history. So if we're racist today and we're favoring a race, in this case it would be blacks over whites, well, that's okay. That has to happen because we have to undo all the wrongs that have been done. Could lead to a really crazy place, right? Okay. Moving on, because I got to go fast. Massachusetts is focused on because the influence of Massachusetts, say Massachusetts 3 times real fast. The influence of Massachusetts Bay was far and wide. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Was far and wide, goes beyond Massachusetts. And again, I got to go fast, but if you remember from your junior high days, I hope, or even in elementary when you learned this, that, Rhode Island, Connecticut, those places came to be as offshoots kind of what was going on in Massachusetts. We talked about John Smith when we talked about Jamestown. Well, he first mapped out this area before the Pilgrims came. They came on the Mayflower, heading for Virginia. They were known as separatists. If you remember, the Church of England came to be when Henry VIII decided that he wanted a divorce and the Pope wouldn't give him a divorce. So the Reformation, which started in Germany in 1517, hadn't hit England yet until King Henry VIII decided, for selfish reasons, that he wanted to break away from the Catholic Church. Well, what happened was, all that really changed in England when it came to worship was, instead of having a hierarchy, Pope, cardinals, bishops, priests, now it was King Henry VIII instead of the Pope. So King Henry VIII didn't necessarily want to do away with Catholicism. He just wanted to have Catholicism under his jurisdiction because he wanted to divorce his wife. In Massachusetts, you had William Bradford, who, like John Smith, under his governorship, the colony grows. Part of the reason that the colony grew is because he made private property a priority instead of the commune. The commune always seems great at first. What a great idea! We're all in this together. The idea of it's great. It's heavenly, right? It's not feasible here on the dirt ball. In a dark and fallen world, it won't work. It's been tried many times. And in small pockets, you have people that voluntarily enter into these agreements to live communally, and that's great. But whenever it's government run, it goes awry and leads to not just poverty, but death and destruction. History shows us time and time again how that happens. So Bradford instituted private property. Hey, things aren't going well because what happens according to human nature? It wouldn't happen to you, but it happens. If I can get food from the storehouse and not have to work for it because she's working so hard, she's filling the storehouse, there are a segment of the population, they're not as good as you, and they're going to take advantage of it. That's just fact. That's humanity. That's the state of our fallenness, right? We're not going to walk in integrity like our school verse this year says. In fact, only those of us that really work at it can really accomplish it. Because back to this, right? That's what dominates our thoughts. Physical world. John Winthrop, he wants to establish a wilderness Zion, as he put it. And they want Massachusetts Bay to be seen as a city upon a hill, using biblical terms to describe, hey, we're going to set up a place that is not heaven, but we're going to show that you can have a godly community where Christians can live together, prosper together, have private property. We're not going to institute an overbearing rule that says everybody has to share everything, but you're going to have your own private property, but out of your Christian heart, if someone's in need, you're going to help them, right? That's the way it's supposed to work. We want this to be seen by all the worlds, the city plan. We can do this. We can live in this fallen world, and as best we can live righteously. Because we're going to, first and foremost, follow God's laws. I'm sorry, if you get a little bit behind, the way I do things, I always start previous, right? I'm not just going to jump into the next day's notes. So you'll see this screen tomorrow and and Thursday probably. Maybe even Friday. So if you do get a little bit behind, leave yourself some space for the next notes. I try to go slowly enough. I look around the room and I see a lot of people sitting there like this, and I'll move on. Yeah.
Can I go to Rush?
Yes, sir. And just in case you had forgotten, I covered it up and I'm not going back now. So all that's behind that is the New England colonies. And the New England colonies are up here in kind of pinkish. Notice that it says, you probably can't see it, but Maine was not a colony. Anybody remember why? Hopefully you can't read it. Does anybody remember why Maine wasn't necessarily called a colony? Even though it's kind of a big state up there and it's part of what we call the colonies, the area is. It was an extension of Massachusetts. So behind this picture, and I don't want to take the time to go freeze the frame and undo it, is New Hampshire and Connecticut and Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Those are the New England colonies. And then you have the middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. And then you have the southern colonies, Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. So you got 4, 4, and 5. Dina knows 4 plus 4 plus 5 is?
Simple math, 13.
Yeah. if you notice, the boundaries there are a little bit abridged because what's really the boundary of the 13 colonies? What are the real geographic boundaries of the original colonies? Yeah, right. You got the Atlantic Ocean and the Appalachian Mountains. Not very many people were feeling secure or adventuresome enough to go ahead and challenge going beyond. Now some did, but going beyond the Appalachians to settle wasn't really happening yet. What was colonial life like 300 years ago? What? Marrying and Burying. What a weird title. Huh? Yeah. Yes. Before I go on, 300 years ago, you're thinking, I'm glad I didn't live back then. In some ways, yes. And maybe in some ways you're thinking, no. Physically, you're probably like, I'm definitely glad I didn't live back then. Definitely glad. I didn't live in a part of history which, by the way, 1700s is much better than the 1400s, which was much better than the 400s, which was much better than 4000 BC, right? Physically. So, marrying and burying, what's that about? When we look back just 300 years ago at the beginning of American colonial life, it wasn't so great physically, but it was, again, greater than previous to them. But for us, whoa, the fact that you had to face the fact that over 10% of would-be births, infant mortality was still over 10%. Thankfully, we in our school family here actually experienced infant mortality last year, but thankfully it's a very rare thing, right? Where at that time, in other words, death was much more part of life. Does that make sense? Even at that stage, even at the beginning of life. And we're going to go through some statistics that show us how much more prominent death was as part of life. So we look at that and we go, whoa, I'm glad I didn't live back then. Because, of course, the worst thing that happened to you is physical death, right? Thankfully, Bella's shaking her head, no. Worst thing that can happen to you is spiritual death, correct? But, what dominates our thoughts is physical. So, harsh times compared. For instance, listen, this isn't to make a political comment at all. This is to make a statistical, historical comment. To have a pandemic of a virus that's really severely affecting literally 0.2% of the population wouldn't even be a blip on their radar. They were dealing with really, I'm not trying to minimize. My family's still going through it. I know people that don't know anyone really close personally that's died from it, but I know of people, I know of indirect relationships. So, it's a real thing. It's scary, right? But the times we live in, we've taken that historically almost insignificant pandemic, statistically, historically, almost insignificant. And look what we've done to our society. Because it's so much better now. Modern medicine, and it almost leads us to cherishing this life a lot more. Am I making sense? I'm trying to go fast yet make you see how life was different then. And we look back, I would never want to live then. But then spiritually, we want to look at the differences too. As we look at colonial America. Where we put a premium on this physical life much more than they did. Because they had to deal with the reality of death much more than we did. Does that make sense? Rapid population growth. A lot of marrying going on, and ladies, gentlemen, a lot of marrying going on at a young age, which is going to lead to this explosion of population in North America, which we now call America in the 13 colonies, from 250,000 at the beginning of 1700s to, at the beginning of the Revolution, 2.5 million people living in the colonies. For those math experts out there, that's a growth rate of how many How many more times, I'm not saying it right, the population grew by how many times? It's kind of a simple math question, ladies and gentlemen. From 250,000 to 2.5 million. Go ahead, throw it out there, you're not gonna be wrong. Come on, somebody out there knows enough math to know that. How many times more than 1,700? From 250,000 to 2.5 million. Move the decimal point one place, Bella. 10 times, right? It increased 10 times in just 75 years. That would be like us going from 300 million now to 3 billion in America. And by the time you were great grandparents. That's a lot of growth. The birth rate in America is twice that of Europe during this time. So not only do you have a country growing because of migration, people coming from Europe, right? You also have a birth rate that's 2 times that of Europe. That's with the infant mortality we're talking about. And the infant mortality, I think we're going to get to that. We already have that up there. Infant mortality. Okay, we'll get to it in a second. According to the 1790 census, speaking of how death was much more part of life, half of Americans, over half, living in 13 colonies in 1790 were under 16. Most of you right now are 16 and under. You account for probably about 1/6 of our population. Maybe 1/5. I don't know the exact numbers. Because 18 and under, because it was a big part of my life a year ago to do a lot of population studies and disease studies and what was happening in our country over the last year and a half. And under 20, in America right now, not quite 25% are under 20, less than 25%. So you figure under 16 was over half, and today it's closer to 1/5 or 60. What's that tell you? If over half the population is under 16, there's a lot of people dying at an earlier age, right?
That's it.
1,700, fellas, competition, tough. Caleb thought the competition was tough at the fair over the weekend. Men outnumbered women more than 2 to 1. And the women were marrying at a much younger age, as you probably know that, right? Remember that. And if you're marrying at a younger age, you are in childbirthing years much longer, so there's going to be more children. You're going to start having children earlier, and you're going to have more of them because you're younger. Your younger years. Most people today only have, 2 kids? I should look up the average. Can I get the price with you? Pretty close to 2. It might even be less than 2 now. The average family size is, I'm going to guess it's like 1.9 children. Yeah, Walker's like, what? Is there a Morgan in here? Trunick and Ellis? Trunick's had 8? Alice has 5, 6. Morgan's had 6. It's a rarity, right? There it is, the infant mortality rate. In the colonies, it's down to 10%. In Europe, it's still 25%. Can you imagine, ladies especially, affects you more than it does men, that you're hey, you still have a pretty good chance of carrying that baby all the way to birth and surviving into adulthood, but 25%? That means 1 to 4?
1.9.
Ha ha!
Not sure what that's.
Oh, yeah, somebody's out there going, why do you have 0.9?
They're missing their hand.
It's average. Right? Average out to let the American families have two kids. And more American families have less than 2 kids than more than 2 kids. Cities are growing in the 1700s, which leads to population density, right? Instead of people having their own piece of land and they got an acre and the only people who live within that acre is their family, cities are starting to grow, people are living closer together. Which means if there is disease, the outbreaks are going to be greater. So, really bad epidemics would take place where a high percentage of people would get really, really sick or even die. Not 0.2%. I mean, really, if you were able to time travel from 1700 to 21st century, you'd be like, you wouldn't understand what all panic is. You'd be looking around like, wait, why all these, what's going on? And you don't have a book yet, but page 51, which I had out earlier, I'm not going to read it to you. It's basically, if you had it, or when you get it, if you get that textbook, it's a diary excerpt of a family that's going through smallpox. Awfulness of it. Again, if you haven't caught up, we'll be on the screen tomorrow. Okay, remember what the theme was last week and into this week? What are we doing? We're trying to set up in your mind, how did America become an English country and how did America become a Protestant country? Because in this time period of the world, most of Christianity is still Catholic. Roman Catholicism, even though there's been a Reformation, is still number one when it comes to Christianity. And it was definitely dominating England in the early 1500s. Again, we talked about until the king decided the Pope wouldn't give him a divorce, so he said, okay, I'll start my own church. But he was still Catholic. So his church, if you were to walk into the Church of England in Henry VIII's days, you wouldn't see much difference between being in a Roman Catholic service compared to an Anglican church service. The only thing that changed was, instead of being under the authority of the Pope and the cardinals and the bishops and the priest, it all started with king. So replace the Pope with the king, and the king would have continued to have the college of cardinals and bishops and priests to run the church. So you would still be under that hierarchy of authority. Except now it's joined the Reformation, and it's in name only Protestant. Does that make sense? Like in today's political culture, we call people rhinos. Anybody know what that stands for? Nobody in here knows what a rhino is, American political vernacular. Republicans in name only, R-I-N-O. Nobody's ever heard of that? So we would say that the Anglican Church was Protestant in name only. And only because of the selfish acts of Henry VIII. Well, Henry VIII's son, Edward VI, surrendered his life. Why wasn't it Henry IX? Remember, they got to choose their titles. Now, when he's ruling in the mid-1500s, these reforms of the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, those ideas, even though the king has taken the place of the Pope, the ideas among the lay people, everybody remembers what a lay person is? L-A-Y? You and I are lay people when it comes to the church. we're not the pastor. Like your parents might not be a lay person. Your dad and mom might be a pastor. But we, the congregants, are lay people. The ideas of the Reformation are starting to take hold amongst the lay people, even if not the hierarchy. Then comes Queen Mary. If you remember her from last year in world history, she's Catholic, and she comes to the throne and she wants to reinstitute and revitalize the Catholic teaching in England. So she goes on this, sends people on this murderous spree. 300 end up being burned at the stake because they refused to renounce Protestantism. So just when the Protestants seem to be gaining control in England, Queen Mary comes in and tries to put an end to it. She doesn't, but she tries. Always relating history to present day. Living at this time in England would be kind of like living in America today. We went, 5 years ago, we were heading this direction, and then we got a president that said, whoop, put the brakes on and headed this direction. And then 4 years later, all of a sudden we go, whoop, and now we got another president to take us. It's like what's going on here? Right? It's like watching a tennis match. Like, culture is being, like, we're like confused, right? Because we were going one direction, and then we got a president elected in 2016 that said enough of that, and we're taking us in this direction. And then the last election, we're going right back in the opposite direction. We're going to undo everything that was done in the last 4 years. And then right now, if you look at the political culture, there's a possibility, a strong possibility, that in 2024, we're going to go whoop and go back the other way. Imagine if you're living outside of America and you're kind of watching from outside. Like, these people have lost their minds. And we're supposed to be the leaders of the free world. Queen Elizabeth comes along. No, not that Queen Elizabeth, the present day Queen Elizabeth. That would be some kind of record. Well, not quite a record, because Methuselah. But she reigned for, math whizzes, 45 years, right? And under her rule, so we had Queen Mary trying her hardest to invigorate Catholicism. Queen Elizabeth makes the Church of England permanently Protestant. Okay, why did I have this slide of notes up here? I'm trying to condense everything for you into the beginnings of American history. So what my theme is over the first 2 weeks is this. You can repeat it for me. Go ahead. What am I trying to establish? Why English and why America is mostly Protestant. The founding of the country. Okay, no notes yet. By vote of the thumb, up or down, Puritans. 1. Only 2, 3 votes. That means, we got one to the side. Puritans, who gives a thumbs up to the Puritans? Who gives a thumbs down to the Puritans? Who gives, I'm not sure of the Puritans. Okay. So, usually the reaction to the Puritans is, what do you think the usual reaction to students to the Puritans is? For most students. Unfortunately, for most students, it's thumbs down. Why? Anybody know why? Do you remember anything? I know you've covered the Puritans with Mr. Lamb. Yeah?
Isn't it because they were trying to, like, make people pure again? Like,
Yeah, what do you mean pure? They're called Puritans
come
because...
back to God?
Okay. Is that a bad thing?
No.
Oh.
But I think they just kind of did it wrong.
Okay, thank you.
Sideways.
What's that?
Why it's thumb sideways.
That's why it's thumb sideways? Because is purifying the church a bad thing? A lot of kids, here's what the public school, here's what they would know about the Puritans. I almost guarantee if you were to ask kids that came from public school, they would say one thing: Salem witch trials. That's people's takeaway. That's what they remember most. When you ask your parents, if you were to ask your parents, you might do this survey, what they thought of the Puritan era, and they would probably immediately say the Salem witch trials, because that's what's emphasized. That was an awful, very short period of time in Massachusetts Bay among the Puritan influence. But that negative period of time is what is what people take away from that period. They wanted to purify the Anglican Church of the Catholic ways. Remember, the Anglican Church was started by a man who was ostensibly, that's a big word, Catholic, but he changed it to the Anglican Church so he could be the head of it. Well, the congregants know what's going on, right? Oh, we're called the Church of England. We're really just Catholic. So as they are learning more and more about the Reformation, they become more and more reformed. They want to institute changes. And the Puritans want to purify the church. We had said earlier that the... Wait, did we already talk about the Pilgrims? I can't say. They didn't want to purify the church. They just wanted to separate. They're like, we're out of here. There's no changing these people. It's a lost cause. The Puritans want to stay within the church and purify it. And they become the most influential religious group in the colonies because we said Rhode Island and Connecticut were direct offshoots of Massachusetts Bay. So the influence of the Puritans goes beyond Massachusetts. Their teachings based on God's covenants with his people. That's not a bad thing, is it? Again, remember what they were trying to do? Create this city upon a hill where the world can see how Christians, we can do this. We can live in this fallen world and still be seen as righteous people. We're going to create a community where we follow God's laws. And the hope is that if we do that, there won't be much need for civil authority creating all of these extra laws with all these extra punishments. We'll just all live godly. And it's almost like we talked about Marxism or socialism and communism, right? Like, it's a great idea in some ways. It just doesn't work. And in order to create this society they want to create, the negative about it is sometimes it's going to require that heavy-handed authority because people are just not going to do it. I mean, if you're a Christian, first and foremost, your job is to glorify God, and secondary to that is to be a light and spread God's message, the gospel, right? And the sad thing is that not everybody's going to believe, right? As much as we want and desire people to know God, you still do it. You still do the work, knowing that a lot of times it's not going to come to fruition because of sin. People aren't going to buy in, and people aren't going to buy in to living like this. One good thing, though, I shouldn't have said that. One positive thing that a lot of people take away from the Puritan idea is this idea of congregationalism. What do you call the people sitting in the pews or the chairs at your church? They're the congregation, right? And at most of your churches, your congregation, see if you've lived through this. You choose your pastor. I know a church that a lot of you go to just a few years ago, Pastor, maybe 4 years ago, I can't remember exactly, but you had people coming in and they were like, hey, maybe this person's going to be the pastor, and then the congregation has their input, and the elders, they vote. That's kind of the way we do it, right, in most of our churches. In the Catholic Church, you've got the Pope and the cardinals, and they have bishops, and the bishops appoint priests to the church. The congregation has no say. The priest is who you get, who they send to you. Well, Puritans trying to establish that city upon a hill, they find out the second generation already is falling apart. They're losing their zeal to have this godly community. when they first started it, they were coming from a place in Europe where they didn't feel like they had the freedom. So, hey, we're going to do this and we're going to make it work. And then their children weren't as zealous about it. They weren't as excited. So a lot of those pure ideas started to the fallen sinful nature of us started to creep in more and more. Here's a big uh-oh. Citizenship depended on church membership. If you were going to be part of Massachusetts Bay, you had to be a member of the church. Why did I put uh-oh there? Why is there an uh-oh next to citizenship dependent on church membership? Yeah. Okay, what else? That's true. This whole idea of religious freedom is kind of the first freedom that people came here for. Yeah.
People started going to church for the wrong reason.
Right. And in Christendom, in our Christianity, in our zeal to spread the message, to spread the gospel, is part of the Christian methodology to get people to God, to force them to accept the gospel? No. We're ambassadors. We're the planters. We spread. We're like, we throw the seeds out there. It's up to God to bring that harvest to fruition. That's not part of Christianity, to basically force people into, and that's kind of what this was doing, right? You had to be a member of the church. Well, if you do that, this covenant you have, you've raised up this community based on a covenant you have with God, that you're going to follow and you're going to be blessed because you're following God, right? Your whole community, we're setting up this city upon a hill. So everybody's got to be in. Well, what about the people that are only doing it because that's the only way you can be accepted in society? They're not really believers, but they're in your church. And then there's more of them in your church, and not really believers. So they're in the congregation, and they maybe even gain influence among the congregants. But they're not even believers in what's going on. That's going to lead to bad things. It's going to lead to where we'll pick up tomorrow to a halfway covenant. I mean, you're old enough to know now that if you do anything halfway, it doesn't work very well, does it? My dad had a different term for it, the halfway. What's the matter? Isaac seems to know all these old sayings that I bring up in class. Halfway covenant. Except it wasn't halfway. The second part started with an A. Right, Isaac? The second part started with an A. Sorry, I didn't even make you feel better.
Nope. Those words are mean.
Your words are meaningless.
Jamie.
Reagan, want to hear my spot? 7. Start from the bottom. Come up.
All right.
My